It's been a shaky year for the global economy, with spiraling insecurity, high inflation, energy crises, and a pandemic. During all of this economic trouble, more than 500 people became billionaires. As the old saying goes, the rich got richer, the poor got poorer. One man believes this is not a bug, but a feature of the global system. I'll ask him how. This is the InnerView. Richard D. Wolff is Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a visiting professor in the graduate program in International Affairs at the New School. He's the host of the weekly program Economic Update and the author of many books, including his most recent, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. Professor Wolff, good to have you on the program. What's the problem with the global economy?
The problem with the global economy is that capitalism is a dynamic system. It changes all the time. For many of the last 2 to 3 centuries, for much of them, it changed in a way that made conditions, at least in North America, Western Europe, and Japan, rise for everybody. Mostly for the capitalists, but enough for the rest of the people to make it a good time. But capitalism always changes, from its origins in England to its expansion in Europe and now to a global system. The centers of capitalist growth always move. They were once in England, then they left. They were once in North America, they have now increasingly left. And what you have is a growth of capitalism in the East, particularly in Asia, but in other parts of the used to be called Third World. But in the core center of the capitalist system, the shrinkage is now obvious. First, the British Empire went down. Now the American empire is in a period of decline. The Chinese and Indian empires are in an ascendant position, and there's a lot of adjustment going on. But the core reality of that adjustment is the reality of a growing gap between the rich and the poor in England, in Europe, in North America, in Japan. And I think this has now been going on since the 1970s. It is a historic process, with or without a pandemic. It is what our generation is living through, and we'd be better off admitting it, facing it, and dealing with it than pretending that something else is happening.
If we admit it, face it, deal with it, do we then have to ask ourselves what's the alternative, given that the alternatives seem to have failed over the past 100 years? You said capitalism's dynamic. It's dynamic, it's creative, it's destructive, but isn't it the best thing we have? Hasn't everything else been tried and failed?
No, I don't think so. I think what we have is a very typical historical process. Let me give you the example from capitalism. The early experiments with capitalism, with an economic system that divides people into a small number of people who are employers and a large number of people who are employees. You know, the way slavery made a small number of people masters and a large number of people slaves, or feudalism that made a small number of people lords and a large number of people serfs, and so on. Each of these systems took a long time to develop. They had early experiments, didn't last. They had to learn how to create a system that survives. What we have seen, particularly in the last century, with the experiments of the Soviet Union, of China, of Cuba, of North Vietnam, and all the rest of those, were the early experiments in going beyond capitalism. Just like the early experiments in capitalism, They failed. They learned lessons, what to do, what not to do. They will, China is the best example, figure out how to make these things work better, just the way capitalism did. It's kind of a repeat. And I think you have to be aware that if you look at early experiments in capitalism, you might have too quickly assumed they didn't work out so that that system can't make it. It's the same mistake at looking at the experiments of Russia and China and not seeing that this is a process in which these countries are learning what to do and what not to do. And I would remind people, and this is not an endorsement of China or anything like that, but I would remind people that for 30 years now, the People's Republic of China has grown 3 times faster than the United States. And that is a summary of where the system is rising, because they have a capitalist system in China too, employers, employees, and where it is declining, the United States. And I say this as an American. I'm not happy about it, but it is a reality, and I will not join the chorus of those who pretend that it isn't happening.
Let me bring in some of the variables over the past couple of years. A pandemic, a global pandemic, war in Ukraine, and all the ripples and ramifications of these things. Inflation, governments trying to deal with inflation, food insecurity, connected to war, connected to all the chaos that's unfolding in Eastern Europe, in Russia, in the Middle East. Are we underestimating the unpredictable nature of all of these things and attributing too much to a system that we think is designed to create inequality?
No, I'm afraid that these things are, if I can dare say it this way, they're typical of a period of serious empire decline. I mean, we do have to understand that it is very difficult for the United States, as it was for the British, to cope with the decline of their own system. This is not a happy period of time. Bitterness happens, and it happens because as the decline deepens, the efforts of those who wish to avoid being taken down with the system make them grab onto and hold on to as much as they can, and to shift the burden of decline onto others. Here in the United States, for example, we have not had a basic increase in the real wage. That's the amount of money paid to an average worker, adjusted for the prices they have to pay for the goods they buy. We've not had a basic increase in the real wage in 35 to 40 years. This is a society which taught its people for a century that this was a special country, that economics would always be growing and expanding and prosperity. We have not begun yet to face all the consequences of the end of a period of expansion, 1850 to 1950, roughly. We haven't explained to our people it's over. It's not coming back. It's gone somewhere else. And in that decline, a kind of desperation can settle into large parts of your population. You can rediscover white supremacy, to take an example from American culture. You can make desperate moves in your foreign policy. You can have a war in the Ukraine, holding on to some notion of your position in the world when that position isn't there anymore. In our press in this country, we create 10 stories about COVID in China for every one about COVID in the United States. It is this desperate effort not to come to terms with a fundamental historical shift, which once favored the United States, now it favors somebody else, and that has to be faced as the first step in coming up with a solution.
So there are two things that seem to be happening at the same time. This fundamental historical shift, there is a shift in economy, there's a shift in power. Yes, and as you're saying, there's a sort of lashing out from the traditional powers. On the other hand, there seems to be a situation where it's business as usual. As I had mentioned at the top, more than 500 new billionaires minted during the pandemic. 40, I stand to be corrected, but I think exactly 40 coming from big pharma. So that's an interesting thing in and of itself, right? On top of that, the Oxfam report from May saying that the 10 wealthiest people in the world control more wealth than the bottom 40% of humanity. That's more than 3.1 billion people. So with that in mind, it seems to be still a very good deal living in the modern age for the super rich, isn't it?
Absolutely. But let me add only one statistic to those you brought forward, and Oxfam does a wonderful job, that the fastest growing location for billionaires in the world over the last 10 years has been the People's Republic of China. That's my point. Yeah, it's capitalism. That's why we have to talk about it. It's the capitalism that has created the unspeakable inequality of the last 3 or 4 centuries. The facts are overwhelming about that. It is not a system that overcomes inequality. In many ways, it exaggerates it. But it has moved to another place. The billionaires are coming out of China a lot faster than they're coming out of every other part of the world. And I think that is the clue. You've got a system that has fundamental problems, and you've got a system that has relocated its core dynamic center. The United States, for example, is in a desperate effort now to stop the Chinese technological advances. The war on microchips, the attack on the Huawei Corporation, the tariff and trade wars of Trump and now Biden. They're trying to hold down the Chinese development. That's not going to work. The Chinese are beyond all that. They have the capacity to do it. You know, it's like the British Empire trying to go to war in the United States in the Revolutionary War of 1775, then again the War of 1812. It didn't work. You can't stop that genie once it's out of the bottle. And the British had to learn you better live with the United States because you're not going to stop it from replacing you. The United States proudly advanced around that. But are we going to have a nuclear war before we learn that we can't do to the Chinese what the British couldn't do to us? There is a kind of historical lesson, pretty obvious in our history, that is being resisted. We got 2 problems, a relocating capitalism and a capitalism itself, and we ought to be exploring how to overcome those problems with solutions.
Okay, and I know that you're not a Republican and you're not some sort of right-wing conservative when it comes to economic policy. Very recently, the US president, Congress and the US president aiming to rubber stamp $1.66 trillion in a stimulus package, folded into it beyond the spending to the military, beyond the spending that would go towards Ukraine in its fight against the Russians, folded in the president saying we've got a lot of money for workers, for job seekers, and to develop our economy from the bottom up. That's a good thing, isn't it?
Yes, but you have to take it all with what the Europeans used to call a grain of salt. You have to be aware of how our politics works. Mr. Biden promises everything to everybody. They gave the military, let me remind everyone, more than the military asked for. I mean, it's a bit crazy in our time, but they did. And then they gave an enormous amount of money to the fight in Ukraine. Because, by the way, in the United States mentality, this isn't about Ukraine. This is about fighting against China. One of China's major allies is Russia. Russia is in that war in Ukraine. And so the Ukrainians become a very useful tool with which to fight the war, so far not military with China directly, but in this indirect way. And he has money for all the needs of the people. That's right. He's going to do everything for everybody. I don't know about how this plays in the rest of the world, but here in the United States, no one believes this. And not because of Mr. Biden particularly, but because that's our custom. It's like when someone meets you on the street and says, "How are you doing?" It's not that they're really that interested in how you are doing. It's because what you say. Politicians say they're taking care of everybody. I can assure you, if you go through, as I have, the $1.7 trillion budget that was just passed, hundreds of programs in the United States were cut. All kinds of economies were achieved. All kinds of money was not spent on all sorts of social services. Why? Because of the understandable fear that this kind of money shoveling that the president says he has is the worst possible thing to do in an inflation.
And the reason I said you're not a Republican, you're not a conservative, is because they were opposing it. A lot of Republican members of Congress were opposing it. So were they opposing it because they're Republicans and he's the president and he happens to be a Democrat, or were they opposing it on correct, sound, principled grounds? And we're at that point where you on the left and they on the right are in agreement over this particular issue.
No, I think they were doing it because it's the politically expedient thing to do. They were handed a very bad defeat, the Republicans and the conservatives, in the last election, that they expected to walk away with enormous gains, none of which materialized. They really don't know what to do. They are a split movement. Mr. Trump is going down. Nobody else is really emerging except another kind of Trump in our Florida governor. It's a bad time for the conservatives. So they're trying to show that they're going to do something else. Very few people follow this in any detail. And the political games and theater that are being played here, that's a dominant story. So when it's important to look like you're doing something, you do it. Right. What the consequences are later, you assume you can hide all of that. So for example, Ukraine, let me give you an example. We are spending amounts of money on Ukraine that are wild, tens of billions of dollars. In the middle of a fight against inflation, the government is pumping up money for a war. Most Americans couldn't tell you where Ukraine was, let alone what the issues there are.
Their calculus, though, the calculus from the government is either we go to war with Russia, and this could be World War III, or we help the aggrieved party under attack from the Russians. That's a political decision, and to help them, you have to spend money, right?
Right. But the question is, are you closer to nuclear war doing what you're doing, or are you closer to nuclear war with an alternative policy?
Right.
Do you need NATO to include Ukraine? Is that an urgent need of the United States?
Yeah.
Most of my Republican friends wouldn't answer that question.
And I don't want us to go down that rabbit hole of making this about the pros and cons or the merits or not of that particular war. But you've mentioned inflation at a time of historically high inflation, not only in the United States, but around the world. People are feeling the effects of it. You've mentioned it twice. I rudely interrupted you twice. And now I want to ask you your opinion on inflation, because you don't have to be Milton Friedman to know the sort of consensus when it comes to economics, when it comes to what happens when there's inflation. High inflation, you come in and you raise the interest rates. That brings down the inflation because there's a tightening of the belts, there's less borrowing, there's less loans spinning around the markets. Inflation comes down. The IMF, in forecasting 2023, they said the global economy could be severely jeopardized by two things: high inflation and the raising of interest rates, which was interesting to me because I'm not an economist, but I'm like, this is the doctor saying both the illness and the medicine are both very dangerous moving forward. I know you disagree with the raising of interest rates. Tell me why.
Well, I will tell you why. Partly you've given me the answer to, I won't repeat it back to you, because it's a disease that can be as bad or worse than it's the cure that can be as bad or worse than the so-called disease it's trying to complete. There's a word in economics to handle that. When you raise interest rates and you force businesses to contract, individuals can't borrow, businesses can't borrow, you lay off large numbers of workers, you have unemployment, but it fails to stop the inflation. The word is called stagflation. It's the mixture of the word stagnant, because you're not giving people work, and still an inflation. I didn't make that word up. That came about because over the last 40 years, repeatedly, that has happened. So the first problem with raising interest rates is it's not a guaranteed cure for an inflation. It has failed to do that repeatedly in recent history. That ought to be front and center. But even more important, an inflation hurts most low and middle income people because they can't afford to spend more. That's not rocket science. Raising interest rates is like that. It's now more expensive to borrow. For a rich person, that's not a big problem. For a huge corporation, not either. But for middle level people, for poor people, these are the terrible ways of dealing with economics. So I want to stress to you and your audience, here are two alternatives to dealing with an inflation by raising interest rates that worked. In August 15th of 1971, the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, a Republican conservative, we have a bad inflation right at that point. He gets on the radio and television and he says to the whole world, we are going to stop this inflation tomorrow morning. And here's how we're going to do it. We're going to pass a law. And as of 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, any employer who raises a price, because let's remember, an inflation is when employers raise prices. Employers are 1% of the population of the United States and of most other countries. So a tiny minority raises prices and we get an inflation. Mr. Nixon said, if you raise a price as of tomorrow morning, we will come to you, we will arrest you, and we will throw you in jail. So I advise you, don't do it. Any worker who pushes for higher wage, we will do the same. It's called a wage price freeze. And you know what? It worked like a charm. It was set for 3 months. It worked so well, it was extended. Now, are there problems with such a policy? Absolutely. There are problems with every policy for inflation. But the notion that you have to raise interest rates to deal with it is contradicted by the most simple awareness of what our history was. Here's the second example. It's in early 1940s. The President of the United States is about to go to war against Germany, Italy, and Japan. Huge portion of our resources in America are going to be used to fight the war. And they're not going to be available to produce consumer goods. Meanwhile, we have the same number of people in America that we had before. The demand for consumer goods is stable. The supply is about to drop because we're shifting to produce for war. Advisors, including my professors, went to the president back then and said, if you don't do something, you're going to have a terrible inflation. Rich people are going to come in with their money, bid up the price of scarce consumer goods, and we will see people with children unable to buy milk, while rich people have the money to pay the high price for milk and give it to their pet cat. Okay, and your society is going to fall apart. Guess what? They canceled the market. That sacrosanct institution of capitalism was just pushed aside, and we had a ration system. The government produced ration books, handed it out to people. If you had many children, you got lots of stamps for milk. If you didn't have many children, you didn't.
Professor
way
Wolff,
you bought
okay, it worked, right? I'm assuming this was Roosevelt, right? It worked. It was World War II. They were also putting Japanese Americans in internment camps, right? Desperate
Absolutely.
measures, extreme measures. So when we're looking at these alternatives, I hear the sound of jackboots. You have to suspend your democracy in order to find some other solutions other than raising the interest rates.
Well, I don't know anything about jackboots. We didn't have jackboots in the 40s, and we didn't have jackboots under Mr. Nixon. So we were able to have a wage price freeze. We were able to have a rationing system. And I'm not aware of anyone who suggested that the level of, quote, democracy in our domestic life was significantly shifted. The war was, as you know, over there, far away from the United States. The United States specializes in having wars far away for the very reason that they don't want the disturbance, because if they did have the domestic disturbance, the war wouldn't be tolerated by the American people for very long. That, by the way, is the number one determinant, not to get back in that rabbit hole,
right,
but the number one determinant of what happens in Ukraine is what happens to the people on the ground in Europe facing their inflation and their energy problems, and what happens to the people in the United States as it begins to dawn on them that they lost a lot of public services while they support a war that they do not understand and that is light years from their daily life.
Professor Richard D. Wolff, a pleasure talking to you. Looking forward to talking to you again sometime soon. I wish you all the best. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, and the best of the new year to you.